Let's get started. Welcome everyone to this Codex speaker event. My name is Roland Vogel. I'm the Executive Director of Codex. Thank you for joining us. We have a great presentation lined up today for you all. We have Cheryl Phillips, who is the Faculty Director of the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, and Johan Gebler, who is a researcher at the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, and they will talk about an important project they've been working on for several years, which is the Debtors prison project, and we're really curious to learn about this work. And I won't keep you from our presenters. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Cheryl and Hans.
Great, wonderful. So it's great to be here and kind of talk about this work. I would say that Hans is really the leader of it, but what we've done is we've tried to kind of combine both, I think, some really rigorous academic research with some journalistic perspective, and our goal is to publish not just to publish academically and also journalistically, so to see what kind of policy change we might have come out of this effort. So I'll let Hans kind of take it from here, perhaps.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hans Gebler. I'm a second-year PhD student at the computational mathematical engineering, and I'm at the Stanford Computational Policy Lab. I'm very excited to talk with all of you this afternoon about our investigation over the past couple of years of debt imprisonment. And as Cheryl said, I'm one of the people who helped lead the project, but it never would have happened without the help of many others. So before I get started, I want to also acknowledge Sarah Nicole, Phoebe Barghouti, Shara Goyle, and of course Cheryl, who's here today, who, as she said, helped out kind of with some of the journalistic and qualitative aspects of our research, and is going to talk a little bit about that at the end. And I should also acknowledge everyone at the Stanford Computational Policy Lab who helped with various technical aspects of this project over the past few years. So debtors' prisons, in the Charles Dickens sense of the word, have been illegal in the United States since the 19th century. But around 2015, reports started to surface in the media of cities in various parts of the United States that were putting people in jail for unpaid fines, fees, and other court debts or legal financial obligations. The quotation shown here is from an article the New York Times ran a couple of years ago about Corinth, Mississippi. It talks about how Jamie Tillman, a Corinth resident, was arrested and taken to jail for public intoxication. 5 days later, she was brought before a judge who assessed a $100 fine and $155 in court fees. Now, Tillman didn't have $250. It's not clear that she had $10. And so when she wasn't able to pay on the spot, the judge explained that she would get $25 of credit for each day she'd spent in jail, and sent her back to jail for another 5 days to finish laying out her fines. Spending even one night in jail is a traumatic experience. And in the end, Tillman spent around 10 days in jail for a $250 fine. So Ms. Tillman's case is an unusually cut and dried example of modern day debt imprisonment. Usually court debtors are sort of nominally arrested for some other more legitimate reason. For instance, a contempt of court, where the contempt in question is ignoring the court's order to pay a fine. But Jamie Tillman's story is not at all unusual, in that every time I've come across a story like hers, I've always seen one question raised, but never answered. And that question is, how many people is this happening to? How many people are there out there like Jamie Tillman? And how many cities are there like Corinth, Mississippi? Are there hundreds of people going to jail for this a year? Are there millions? And so this question is important, for raising awareness of debt imprisonment, but maybe even more importantly, it's kind of critical if you're going to try to target cities and states where things are really bad. Unfortunately, the question is hard to answer because there's no government agency that systematically tracks debt imprisonment of the kind that happened to Jamie Tillman. And so there's no centralized repository where cases of debt imprisonment are recorded that we could look at. So to fill that gap, in 2019, we launched the Debtors Prisons Project with the goal of documenting as many people like Jamie Tillman as we could find. Filling the data gap around debt imprisonment involved 4 main pieces. Oops, excuse me. So first we had to gather the raw data that showed who had been jailed and why. And the documents that we were after are often called jail booking reports or jail rosters, and we had to get them at the county level all across the United States. We also did reporting and interviews to try to understand kind of the human side of debt imprisonment and aspects of the process that we might have missed just from looking at the data. Excuse me. We also had to build a data ingestion pipeline that was necessary to kind of process and clean the data that we were gathering. And then the last step was to analyze the clean data that we produced to try to understand kind of the scope and nature of this problem. So after doing all this work, we learned a number of things, the most important of which I'd like to sort of run through with you before we really jump into the details. First, it's clear from our research that there are tens of thousands of jail bookings each year for failure to pay court debts. So this is a substantial and widespread issue. I've read and written this number a lot of times at this point, but I still find it sort of staggering, especially in light of the fact that if you'd asked me 4 years ago if this was happening to anyone, I maybe naively would have thought that the answer was no. We also know something about why these individuals are being jailed. So in particular, it seems like in a majority of cases, the fines that are going unpaid are for relatively minor offenses, especially things like traffic offenses. And lastly, we know something about the costs and the burdens that the system is placing on the people who get caught up in it. So most people jailed for failure to pay are spending a night or a day or less behind bars, but there's a substantial group of people who are spending days or even weeks in jail for no other reason than failing to pay court debts. So to get kind of a clearer sense of what modern day debt imprisonment concretely looks like, I want to walk through a case study of a single person who was jailed for failure to pay. So Ms. Smith is someone who agreed to talk with us for this project. She lives in Austin. She has 2 kids, and like the majority of people in Austin, she's very reliant on her car. She drives to work, she drives her kids to school, she drives to visit family members, and so on. And she's also someone who's jailed for unpaid traffic tickets. So as we walk through Ms. Smith's story, I want to flag that it has some atypical aspects. I think chief among them is the fact that she was ultimately able to obtain legal representation and kind of end the chaos that had grown up around this issue for her. But I think her story also provides a compelling example of how someone could find themselves in the position of going to jail for failure to pay and what some of the human costs of debt imprisonment are. So Ms. Smith was arrested on November 17th in 2017, and she worked at a convenience store in the Austin area, and she was leaving her shift that night, which had ended at around 11 p.m. And a few minutes later, as she was driving home from work, Ms. Smith was pulled over by a police officer, ostensibly for rolling through a stop sign. And at the time, her license was suspended. So when she was pulled over, she explained, that her license was suspended up front to the officer, and she'd been in similar situations in the past, and the officer had always let her off with a ticket or a warning. But that night, when the officer ran her license, they saw that there was a failure to pay warrant for her arrest. And so they arrested her and took her to the Travis County Jail. Ms. Smith was booked into the jail at around 1 a.m. Probably goes without saying, but Ms. Smith described staying in jail as a kind of a disgusting and traumatic experience, that she could touch the toilet from her bed and the only drinking water available to her was from a tap installed over the toilet. And then the next morning at around 10 a.m, she was brought before a judge to explain why she hadn't paid her unpaid traffic tickets. And then she was put on a new payment plan for those court debts, and then she was released. And that was the first time, actually, she'd been able to really contact anyone about what had happened to her. So a friend had been watching her kids for her the night before while she was at work, and they didn't have any idea why she hadn't come home the previous night after her shift ended. So to be absolutely clear, Ms. Smith is not someone who's a danger to herself or to others. Her only criminal record was a misdemeanor theft charge stemming from a bounce check for $35 she'd spent on groceries, I think more than a decade before this happened. So, there's really a question here of like, how does somebody like Ms. Smith end up in jail? And the story actually begins many, many years prior to her arrest. So it all starts in 2008 when Ms. Smith was pulled over by the police in Austin, Texas for failure to maintain financial responsibility, which means in layman's terms that she was driving without insurance. The next year, Ms. Smith received an additional speeding ticket and later another charge for driving without insurance. For somebody in the kind of financial situation where they're seriously considering driving without liability insurance, this is already getting to be pretty expensive. So under the city of Austin's current fine schedule, these two tickets would have cost Ms. Smith around $600. But in fact, that's actually not all that she owed. So under Texas's now repealed driver responsibility program, up to $750 in surcharges could be added to each fine like this. So Ms. Smith would have been notified of her surcharges by mail at her last known address. And then if she failed to pay them in full, her license would have been automatically suspended. So unsurprisingly, a turning point in this process occurs in 2010 when Ms. Smith's license is automatically suspended for non-payment of her original failure to pay, failure to maintain financial responsibility charge. Now, in addition to tickets for moving violations and driving without insurance, Ms. Smith is in jeopardy of getting tickets for driving with a suspended license. In fact, that's exactly what we see. So over the next few years, Ms. Smith is repeatedly ticketed for 1, failure to maintain financial responsibility, 2, driving with a suspended license, and 3, failing to appear at court dates for her other tickets. Now, I don't know why specifically Ms. Smith missed some of her court dates, but at the very least, number one, she's already not legally supposed to be driving anyway because of her, she doesn't have liability insurance and her license is suspended. Number two, a lot of municipal courts, including ones where she had cases, are, they're only open during the workday. So every time this happens, potentially around $1,000 is being added to Ms. Smith's court debt. And by the time she was arrested in 2017, Ms. Smith suspected that she owed around $10,000, almost all of which can be traced back to her initial failure to maintain financial responsibility charge, which, again, is already kind of speaking to a precarious financial situation. As a matter of fact, actually, the records that you would need to verify exactly how much Smith owed no longer seem to exist. But at the very least, she is owing, in 2017, like not tens of thousands, but thousands of dollars, all for relatively minor traffic offenses. So just to reiterate, Ms. Smith's story shows us what some of the costs of this system are. First is kind of this unpayable debt that she accumulated, which had, a very direct impact on her ability to provide for her family. It's something that she found sort of, managing it to be very stressful. 2, there's kind of the trauma and indignity of being in jail. And 3, there are sort of downstream consequences of being jailed without warning. So in Smith's case, her kids, didn't know where she was when she went missing the night before. And had she had a morning shift at her job, she could have easily lost her job. Had she had a rent check due, it could have threatened her housing and so on. So it's clear that there are other people, potentially a lot of other people out there like Ms. Smith or Jamie Tillman, but the question that we want to really address here is how do we find them? And so the way that we attempted to try to find people who had been jailed for failure to pay was by using publicly available information. We did 2 things. When relevant information was available on the internet, we scraped it. So when court records were available on the internet, we would scrape it. And when that didn't work, we would file public information requests directly with county jails. And so the larger and more difficult aspect of the project really ended up being filing these requests with county and local governments. Over the course of the couple of years that we were working on this, we filed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 public records requests. And so this map shows all of the states across the United States where we tried at some point to kind of on a statewide basis to find records that would let us count the number of people who were jailed for failure to pay. Of all of those states just shown, we received usable data, jail booking data from the states shown in green. So from 64 of 254 counties in Texas, those counties account for roughly 14 million people, which is about half of Texas's roughly 30 million residents, and 27 of 72 counties in Wisconsin, which accounts for 3 million people, again, about half of Wisconsin's 6 million residents. We also gathered failure to pay warrant data from all of Oklahoma, which is about 4 million people, and all of Delaware, which is about 1 million people. So unfortunately, we really weren't able to gather anything usable from the states still shown in blue, or at least, we weren't able to get what we would need to kind of understand what was going on a statewide basis. And again, we were filing these public records requests, nearly 1,000 in total, sort of in parallel at the county level. So all of these public records requests produced a lot of data, but unfortunately the data couldn't be used just kind of as is. So to process everything that we collected, we had to build an automated data cleaning pipeline. And so the first stage of the pipeline was to sort of convert like the raw data, which arrived in like a huge variety of formats. We're talking like PDFs, Excel sheets, databases, TXT files, occasionally like paper in the mail, into a uniform, quote unquote, rectangular format called a CSV, or comma separated values, which is just like a kind of pared down spreadsheet. And then the contents of the columns of each of these spreadsheets. So for example, like the booking date or the warrant type or the charge had to be sort of automatically classified. And then the results of this automatic classification were sort of checked by a human through a web interface. Then once we knew kind of what was in the columns, we had to sort of take the contents of each of these columns and automatically standardize or parse what was in them. So for instance, to record that somebody who's arrested was a woman, you might get sort of the word woman, you might get just the letter W, you might get the word female. And so we had to take all of these different ways of recording the same information and coerce it to a uniform token. So which in our case, we use the word female. So this is more complicated than you might think. Depending on context, for instance, the letter W, it might mean white or it might mean woman. If you have a pair of letters like WM, you have to sort of correctly recognize that as white male and parse it into two separate tokens. Names have to be parsed into the correct first name, middle name, last name format, and so on. So, this is actually sort of more complicated than maybe it seems at first glance. Next, we had to take bookings and deduplicate them. So either because of sort of clerical errors or how the kind of raw data they sent us or local recording practices, it was often the case that a single jail booking would sort of show up in multiple places in the raw data. And so we had to kind of collect all of those different pieces and join them together into a single unit to recognize that it was just one booking. And after we'd done that, then we would take the contents of each of the fields. So again, booking dates or ages, et cetera, and we had to standardize them. And so what the thing that we're worried about here is that we have to make sure that there aren't parsing errors or sort of easily detected clerical errors. So for instance, sometimes you'd see booking dates before the year 2000, or sometimes you'd see them before the year 1900. You'd see zip codes that don't actually correspond to any locations in the US. People whose ages were less than 15 or greater than 100, or, so all these things that we want to sort of take out of the data because they're obviously not, either represent some sort of a mistake. Then after that, we would try to impute missing information as best we were able. So for instance, if we had someone's date of birth, we could use it to impute their age. If we had their last name and zip code, then we can use census data to make a reasonable guess of their ethnicity and so on. And this is also kind of the step of the pipeline at which the information at the booking report would be used to determine whether or not the booking was a failure to pay jailing. And the very last step was to sort of sanitize the data to remove personally identifiable information. So specifically, we wanted to make sure that, for instance, there weren't any strings that like accidentally contained somebody's social security number or something like that. And the reason you have to worry about this is because we're dealing with, millions and millions of records, and all sorts of stuff can creep in. Okay, so, one question that I sort of want to address here is, why weren't we able to gather more data? And there are a few important factors that made data gathering difficult. One is that the local officials who were in charge of responding to our requests were often not all that excited to get back to us.
I think that's an understatement, Hans.
Yeah. And two, even when they did want to get back to us, they weren't able to use their record management software to produce kind of responsive materials. Three, even when they did share responsive materials, often the materials didn't actually indicate in any way which individuals were being arrested for failure to pay. And then the last piece is just that, which I won't talk about quite as much, is just that the officials we were corresponding with, when they didn't sort of obey local open records laws, because we were filing so many requests in parallel, like literally hundreds of requests at a time, we didn't really have any kind of leverage or way of getting them to comply with their record keeping duties. So
one thing I think I could jump in here on is this is an endemic problem, right? And I'm sure all of you know that public records laws vary from state to state. And so then making sure we understood the requisite state law and where we could push back, how we could push back, what was whether there was a right of appeal, whether what the time frame was, what level of redaction was allowed, what were the exemptions in the law. All of that was very tied to the specific state, and then even sometimes the local jurisdiction. So that meant there's an inordinate amount of person time in responding back to local officials who are resistant to providing data. And historically, local officials are resistant to providing data. They sometimes will provide documents, right? That's their, you want this one file, fine. If you're asking for data, public information officers really rarely understand what you're asking for. And trying to move them into a space where you can talk about data or involve an IT person, it again takes a lot of person hours. And so that slows the entire process and makes it harder to scale. Go ahead, Hans.
Yeah, well, so thanks, Cheryl. Just to walk through some kind of anecdotes to illustrate what Cheryl was just saying. In terms of not wanting to respond to our requests, as Cheryl said, often local officials were very sort of resistant to the idea of providing us with these documents as data, I guess. And so people had a variety of ways that they would employ to try to kind of keep us from getting the records that were typically very frustrating, but occasionally pretty funny. So, often people wouldn't take our requests very seriously. And one way they would try to scare us off is by charging outrageous amounts of money. So this is an example from Wichita County, Texas. And I think this was the record for the most money anyone tried to charge us for our public records requests. We did eventually negotiate them down to, I think, sending us the records for free, but this was their opening bid. Often the records clerks were pretty angry with us and didn't hesitate to let us know in a variety of sort of colorful ways. But I think the most frequent outcome actually was just that we were simply ignored, even after making sort of repeated requests and attempts to make contact, and the fact that the one thing that does seem to be more or less uniform across public records laws in different states is that you have to reply. So, so part of why some clerks were so upset with us, or public information officers were so upset with us, is that often this was sort of the first time that local officials had gotten a request of this type. And they, I think, assumed incorrectly, but assumed that it would be virtually impossible for them to respond to us, in part because they weren't comfortable maybe with the records management software that they use. So as I mentioned before, a big part of this process was converting records that came to us in a variety of formats to the sort of correct format that we could use. And so the initial part of the data pipeline, for instance, that we just talked about was constructed precisely to deal with this. But there's some minimum requirements. Like if you're sending us 1,000 sheets of paper in the mail, it's like we really can't do anything with that. So ideally, we would want to get something that was at least in electronic form. And figuring out how to get their jail booking records out of their system and to us in an electronic form was, for some people, a very difficult process, understandably. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get our hands at any point on like a copy or a demo of the software that the public information officers were using to help them figure it out. But by making even more public records requests for like screenshots of people as they were using the software, we actually were able to piece together enough information to write like a step-by-step guide to exporting the records from a bunch of common records management software brands. So one of those guides is pictured to the right. And the kind of the last obstacle was just that, in the records that we would get, what we needed kind of above all was like a clear indication that somebody was jailed for failure to pay. And most of the states that I showed before that we looked into, but ultimately didn't pursue, we ended up abandoning simply because they didn't seem to record when an individual had been jailed for failure to pay. So Texas is an example of a place where it was often clearly recorded when an individual had been arrested for failure to pay. In Texas, there's a specific kind of warrant issued known as a capias pro fine, and a capias pro fine is a writ that is issued by a court having jurisdiction of a case after judgment and sentence for unpaid fines and costs. So that's from the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. And the upshot of this basically is that when you see capias pro fine, you know that it's for failure to pay. So we were able to use capias pro fine warrants to distinguish instances where the warrant was issued specifically for failure to pay from other kinds of bench warrants that might be issued for other reasons.
And I think, this is a really important point, because that's the thing that's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be jailed just because you owe money, right? That's just not supposed to happen. And so being able to tease that out, especially in Texas, I think is critical.
But unfortunately, this use of capias pro fine warrants is, to the best of my knowledge, like completely unique to Texas. And so, it doesn't generalize to other states. And even within Texas, capias pro fines often go unrecorded. So, from a data gathering standpoint, even Texas is not perfect. But nevertheless, despite the difficulty, we were ultimately able to gather a pretty substantial amount of data about debt imprisonment. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes kind of unpacking the three main points that I listed out before. So first is that tens of thousands of people per year are likely being jailed for unpaid court debts. Second, in a large majority of cases, the underlying offense is minor, something like speeding. And in many cases, actually, the only way that you could have been jailed for the offense was by getting a fine for it and then failing to pay it. And lastly, while most failure to pay jailings last a day or less, many people are spending days or even weeks in jail for failure to pay alone. So before we really jump into the quantitative details, it's worth spending a minute kind of defining more precisely how exactly we operationalize this idea of being jailed for failure to pay. So the reason there's any ambiguity at all is that very often individuals are booked into jail with multiple alleged offenses. So for instance, if someone is booked on both a robbery charge and a capias pro fine charge, is it really fair to say that the individual is booked sort of because of their failure to pay? Maybe, but it seems more likely that all else being equal, like they still would have gone to jail for the robbery charge, even if they hadn't had the capias pro fine, but maybe things wouldn't have vice versa, they might not have gone to jail. So to try to kind of deal with this ambiguity, we took each offense that an individual was booked with and tried to classify it as failure to pay related or not. And we would identify failure to pay related offenses using sort of keywords and phrases like the abbreviation FTP, which is very frequently used to abbreviate failure to pay, or CPF in Texas, or phrases like, laying out somebody's fines, things that indicate that the charge reflects somebody sort of being in jail specifically because they failed to pay. And then we counted an individual as having been booked for failure to pay if and only if every charge associated with the booking was for failure to pay. So I should flag that this is like under-inclusive in some ways. For instance, if someone had a capias pro fine warrant, which was discovered when a police officer was ticketing them for some other minor offense, such as speeding, and both charges appeared in the jail booking report, we wouldn't count that person as having been jailed for failure to pay. So this is, the numbers we're showing are sort of a very conservative definition of being jailed for failure to pay. Okay, so I want to start just by looking at the state of Texas. And what this plot shows is the number of bookings for failure to pay alone per million residents per year. And you can see that there's a reasonable amount of kind of noise or uncertainty in what the rate is here, but overall, like the per capita rate of bookings for failure to pay seems to be roughly something like 1,500 million bookings per million residents per year. And so if you scale that up to the population of the whole state, that's around 35,000 people per year. Although, I want to flag that rather than thinking of this as like an extremely precise estimate, like our goal here is really to sort of get the order of magnitude right. The counties that we're using to model this are not like a random sample of Texas counties. They're the ones that were able to give us data. And so, there's some unmodeled uncertainty in this number, but putting that aside for a moment, it's still, a little bit hard to kind of make sense of what this number really means. So like, how does this compare to rates of bookings for what I might sort of naively or intuitively think of as a real crime? And so the red dotted line here in this plot indicates the per capita arrest rate for burglary in the state of Texas during the same period. And so you can see that it falls kind of well below the blue line. So at the very least, it seems like more people are being jailed for failure to pay than burglary by a wide margin. So, it seems like reasonable evidence that Texas law enforcement and courts are kind of devoting substantial resources to jailing people for failure to pay. The last thing I want to talk about with this plot is, if you look at 2015, you can start to see kind of a decrease in the number of bookings. And so, this is likely attributable to a few different things. The first is that the Department of Justice's investigation of Ferguson, Missouri was released in 2015. The investigation highlighted in part aggressive and kind of illegal fine collection practices in Ferguson. So around this time, probably a lot of municipalities are seeing this and starting to get more cautious themselves. Around the same time, a bunch of big cities in Texas, I think El Paso and Austin and maybe a couple others, got sued for putting people in jail illegally on capias pro fine warrants. And lastly, in 2016, a bill was passed by the Texas state legislature that kind of set a higher standard for putting people in jail for failure to pay. It made the sort of indigency the indigency hearing requirements sort of more substantial and things like that. So together, these things, these three things that I just listed seem to have made a dent, but it's not as if the practice has gone away completely. In most, it seems like maybe it's dropped by around half or something like that. So, one question that's worth asking is, could this decrease sort of just be part of simply like a larger decrease in illegal behavior that's happening more broadly? And it actually seems to be the case that, for instance, if you look at the same plot, burglary arrests are going down during the same period. So maybe it's the same thing. But in fact, there's, reason to believe that this decrease in capias pro fine, in failure to pay arrests is real. So this is a plot showing what percentage of all jail bookings are failure to pay jail bookings over the same period. And so what you can see is that the percentage of bookings that are for failure to pay alone is going down relative to bookings for other kinds of things. So, so it really does seem to be the case that something is changing specifically about failure to pay bookings sort of from, 2015 on. Okay, so next I want to contrast what we just saw in the state of Texas with Wisconsin. So our estimate in Wisconsin is noisier since Wisconsin is smaller, although, again, I want to emphasize that the goal here is really to understand the order of magnitude. But overall, the rate that we see seems to be roughly the same. But one big difference that you notice in this plot is that there's no big push to end failure to pay in Wisconsin, or at least, during this time period. And so consequently, there's no real decrease in the rate of failure to pay arrests after 2015, the way there was in Texas. In addition to arrest rates, we can also say something about why people are being jailed for failure to pay. So this plot is looking at what the underlying charge was for people who were actually arrested for failure to pay a loan in Texas and Wisconsin. And as you can see, far and away, the most common source of court debt that people are eventually arrested for is coming from traffic violations. So I do want to, make clear, though, like in many cases, we don't actually know what the underlying charge is. It's not listed anywhere. So it's at least possible that there's a big chunk of failure to pay arrests that are coming for like more serious charges that aren't showing up in our data. But, for a variety of reasons, it seems like that's reasonably unlikely. The non-traffic offenses that we have data for are kind of a hodgepodge, and so they're not super easy to categorize, but reasonably large numbers of people seem to be being arrested for failing to pay tickets, for public intoxication, possession of small amounts of marijuana, minor theft, so think like less than $150, disorderly conduct, and so on. And also, like way out on the right side of this plot, you would find non-trivial numbers of people going to jail for things you never, or at least I never, would have expected. So like truancy, not vaccinating their pets is something that I saw more than once, which I would have imagined that it would be impossible, but there are people who are jailed for unpaid citations for not vaccinating their pets. Okay, and so this is a similar data, but I want to flag that we're switching gears a little bit. So this is not the same data that we're just looking at from Texas and Wisconsin. This is warrant data from the state of Oklahoma. And so the data this is coming from is different. It's all warrants gathered from all 1.7 million court cases that occurred in Oklahoma over roughly the last decade. And importantly, we don't know whether or not the warrants were ultimately executed. So we can't trace them to somebody actually being in jail, but we can still sort of tell us some useful things about what's going on. So what this plot shows is the case type of all of the cases from the last decade in which a failure to pay warrant was issued in Oklahoma. And it seems like there are many more warrants issued for sort of more serious offenses, so criminal misdemeanors or criminal felonies, than what we saw when we were looking in Texas and Wisconsin. I will say, one thing, I'm not a lawyer, so I got to be a little bit careful here, but one thing that it seems to me is that the category of criminal misdemeanors in Oklahoma kind of straddles a reasonably wide range of offenses. So, for instance, furnishing tobacco to a minor in the state of Oklahoma is a criminal misdemeanor. But I think the important takeaway here is still that the largest contributor is traffic violations. Okay, the very last point I want to touch on is how long people are spending in jail when they're jailed for failing to pay. So this plot is showing the frequency of different jail stay lengths for individuals booked for failure to pay only. And I want to note that the y-axis is on the log scale here. So you have to, if you want to try to figure out what the average is or something, you have to transform it a little bit in your head. But as we saw in Ms. Smith's case, most jail stays are short. So roughly half of people are spending a day or less in jail for failure to pay. Of course, I don't want to understate the cost of spending a day in jail. It's long enough to miss a shift, or not be able to get your kids from school, or a whole bunch of other bad outcomes, especially since it's usually happening without warning. But one thing that's worth noting is that the tail of this plot is reasonably heavy. So the average jail stay is actually 2 days in Texas, and it's 6 days in Wisconsin. So what that means is that there's a substantial chunk of people who are spending reasonably long periods of time, days or weeks, or even in like the very most extreme cases, months, in jail just for failure to pay, or at least that's the only thing listed. So, so just to summarize briefly, we estimate that tens of thousands, at least approximately 35,000 people in Texas and 9,000 people in Wisconsin, are being jailed for failure to pay a loan each year across the United States. These individuals, in the majority of cases, are being jailed for failing to pay fines and fees for relatively minor offenses. And while a typical court debtor is spending a day or less in jail, it's by no means unheard of for people to spend days or even weeks in jail. So, one question that's worth asking is sort of what could you do about it? And I think policymakers have a number of kind of levers at their disposal here. One is to make better use of alternative sanctions. So things like community service, community service are very underutilized. They don't impose the same kinds of burdens that monetary penalties do for a lot of people. Another option is to sort of reduce fines and fees. I think it's pretty self-explanatory why, if tickets cost less money, fewer people will go to jail for not paying them. But a third option that's maybe a little bit less obvious is to sort of realign the financial incentives of, traffic courts or other low-level courts. And the reason is that often the costs of jailing people and the revenue that's generated from collecting fines are showing up in kind of the budgets of different government entities, even though they're sort of part of the same overall process. And so when you look at from the kind of the bird's eye view, looking at the process as a whole, it's sort of, you can see that costs and benefits of doing this are getting out of whack. So if traffic courts were funded differently so that they didn't have to generate revenue from aggressively enforcing fines for sort of petty offenses, or alternatively, if they saw some of the cost for putting people in jail for these minor offenses, I've got to believe that it would go a long way to reducing how often people are jailed for failure to pay. I think the last and probably the best option is just to not. I'm not really being facetious here. Some states have more or less completely banned the practice, just with seemingly no ill consequences. So Colorado is a good example of this. They banned jailing people for municipal ordinance violations in 2014. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not as if public order has collapsed in the state of Colorado in the meantime. And the hope is that, by putting these recommendations in place, that you could avoid kind of needlessly jailing tens of thousands of people a year. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl for a second here.
Okay. Still driving for me though? Yeah, thank you. So, so going along with the what can we do about it, one of the things that we can do about it is also do journalism out of this, right? We've been talking with some news publications about publishing a story using both some anecdotal reporting where we've talked to like some individuals, like the person that Hans cited at the top of the presentation, where we've interviewed them in depth, we've fact checked their stories, we've kind of brought it to a human level, and then we've integrated that with our data to try to tell a compelling story. So why hasn't this been published yet? Because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so things got slowed down. But we're still working to get this published. We think it's really valuable, and I think that using journalism can help raise awareness, and that can help spur change. I've seen it over and over again, and so that's one of our key goals here. There has been some publication of stories like this, for the most part anecdotal, and even those anecdotal alone stories can change state laws, can change local policies. So we're ultimately very hopeful that we'll be able to publish, likely someplace in Texas, because that's where the bulk of our data is, and that can help kind of shift the tenor of the conversation around this. Okay.
Thanks, Cheryl. And the very last thing that I want to mention is just to say that as part of this, we've also built a web portal where you can download all of the data that we collected and cleaned, and also kind of walk through all of the analysis I just presented. We're planning to launch it very soon, at the same time as we release the kind of journalism that Cheryl was talking about. And so we hope that when we do that, you'll check it out and make use of this data, and kind of read through our analysis. So I think we have some time now for questions. So I just want to thank you all very much for your polite attention. And Cheryl and I are very happy to answer questions about any questions you might have about this work.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hans and Cheryl. This is really fascinating work. Maybe I can start off with a question. I'm curious to know a little bit more about, sort of the kind of person that gets into that situation. Is it always an indigent person, or is it maybe people who are sort of like, kind of living a little bit outside, have a little bit less sort of respect for the power of the state, and this is sort of like a means of last resort of the state, where it's like the state is like, okay, they're not responding to other signals, and so that's the last thing we have to show that the state has some power remaining, and we'll just throw them into jail. Do you have a sense of what
that's an interesting question. I mean, based on some of the individuals that we've reached out to and the individual cases that we had a couple of reporting trips to Texas. We sat through some court hearings, some of the reporters involved in the project, and I'd say it's a kind of a little bit of both, and that the last thing some of the individuals that we talked to were going to do was pay a court fine if it came between other needs, right? Maybe they needed to pay rent first, or put gas in their car first, or maybe they had an addiction, and so there was also an issue related to that, or but so are we talking about people who are sometimes on the fringe? Yes, but we're also talking about people who are kind of just struggling to make ends meet, and they have childcare needs, or they got to drive their child to their mom's house two towns away, and then drive back to the convenience store to go to work. And so, like, if they have spare money, it's not going to go to a court fee, I think.
Right. And do you have a sense also of what is sort of the consequences for folks, once they're out of jail again? Is that going to be on their record forever? And is there sort of a sense also what the long-term consequences are, other than, sort of having spent some time in jail? Do they lose jobs, or what?
I'm not sure if they well, I would think if they spend some time in jail, they might lose their job because they can't show up to work, for one thing. And the other thing is they might not get jobs they would otherwise want to apply for, because they have something like a failure to pay on their record. I don't know, Hans, if you want to weigh in at all. But.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's kind of hard to. I think these are all questions that I would love to, or we would love at the lab would love to answer sort of like rigorously, and try to sort of like fit this together with other data about kind of these longer term consequences. But it's quite hard to like solve that matching problem of like taking a record of somebody who is in jail at a certain point in time and kind of like figuring out what's happening to them later on, at least at the scale that we're looking at. So unfortunately, I think we have to answer kind of anecdotally, but I think there's a strong sense from the people that we've talked about is that often like actually being jailed is it's not the icing on the cake. Whatever the opposite of the icing on the cake is, it's like the kind of the worst part, the culmination of like a very long process, like what we saw when we were walking through Ms. Smith's case of, there's like this very unmanageable debt, and it comes with all of these other sort of like consequences, like having your driver's license suspended, which in a lot of places that don't have great public transportation, it's like a very significant, sort of economic and personal sanction to give to somebody. So, I think, it's hard to like say specifically whether this is like, other than in anecdotal cases we're aware of, whether this is like resulting in people losing their jobs or things like that. But I think the kind of the system that this is a part of as a whole seems to be extracting sort of like pretty serious, causing pretty serious problems for the people who are getting caught up in it.
Got it. Thank you. So Damien is asking, there seems to be a strong annual cycle to failure to pay bookings. Can you explain or speculate on why?
Yeah, So the short answer is I'm not totally sure. It is true. You do see this kind of annual cycle. I think it has to do with, I'm aware of, like, in Texas, on occasion, counties will have kind of like warrant drives where they try to like get people to come in, and like, they'll try to get everyone to come in and clear their capious profile warrants at the same time, I've seen, or other things like that. So, that might be one thing that's kind of driving part of it, but I'm not sure what else might be driving seasonality. It's also, to keep in mind that there's a certain amount of noise. So it's not totally clear to me also that the seasonality is real and not just kind of an artifact of the data analysis.
And there's also, there's seasonality in criminal trends too, as well. So, but I don't, we really didn't delve into that quite so much.
Got it. Okay. Damien's also asking if your analysis taking race or ethnicity into account.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that we really wanted to look at. And it was a little bit hard because the data quality was not that high. And I think Cheryl can probably talk about this a little bit more in other contexts of projects we've worked on, like the Open Policing Project, where the kinds of data that we get on race or ethnicity is actually not all that usable. I do have a slide here in the appendix that we can look at, just trying to look at ethnic and racial disparities in Texas. So this is kind of a subset of a subset now that we're talking about. So this is a smaller set of counties than even the set of counties that gave us data on failure to pay. So a certain amount of caution is warranted in interpreting these results, but basically what it seems like is that you don't see huge disparities above and beyond what you would expect looking at the demographic breakup of people kind of in the lowest, say 20% of income, or people living below the poverty line in a given county. So roughly, it seems like the demographics of people being arrested for failure to pay kind of match the demographics of people living in a given county who are living below the poverty line.
Got it.
But again, because we don't have great data for every single county, it's hard to say for sure if that's what's going on everywhere.
It's not you can use a surname analysis, but there's often not explicit race or ethnicity information given, or we're not completely clear on the provenance of it. And Texas, as a I guess a reminder, is like Texas is one state where there were big problems for a while with policing data, where state patrol officers were routinely listing Hispanic and Black drivers as white in a way that made it appear that their disparities for police stops were far lower than they were. That practice has changed in part because of some journalism that came out of it, but out of some data analysis. But there are questions about how well that data is kept.
Got it. James is asking whether, based on your initial observation of data and your sense of the issue, is it likely that Wisconsin and Texas are outliers in the amount of people they incarcerate? Is it more likely that there are many other states that are doing the same, or is it too difficult to say?
I think unfortunately it's really hard to say whether or not they're outliers. They don't need to be extreme outliers before this is like a really serious national issue. But I will say that in other places where we're able to get sort of a smattering of data, a small amount of data, it's not as if we don't see people being arrested for failure to pay. It's more the issue is that we're not able to get data on sort of like a statewide basis. So we can't say for sure what's going on in, say, the state of Kentucky or something like that. So my guess is that, they're within an order of magnitude, which is kind of how I think about all of this analysis, probably representative of kind of the typical United States state. But, again, we can't say for sure without actually looking at the data. So.
Okay, great. I think Mike Mike had his hand up before. Mike is I don't think he's Liverite. I think he still has his hand up. Mike, do you want to unmute yourself? Hello, you still there? Or maybe he's no longer. He might not have the same question anymore. But let me see. Good. Any other questions, folks? What do you think is sort of the next phase of this project?
So go ahead, Cheryl.
Well, I was just going to say that the most immediate next phase is to get a story published out of this, I would say, and then see what kind of response can come from that, particularly in Texas.
Got it. Okay, so
yeah, I think that we would love for policymakers or, kind of civil rights groups or whoever to kind of make use of this data to try to curtail the practice.
And one thing to that point is once the data is available for download, one of the things that on the journalistic side that Big Local News, which is kind of a partner organization to the Policy Lab, does is we train, when we did with this open policing data, where we train local journalists on how to analyze the data so they can use it for important accountability reporting. That's something I could envision happening.
Okay. So yeah, fortunately, I realized like you actually folks can't unmute themselves the way our Zoom is set up. So Mike kindly shared his question through the chat, and he's asking whether you asked politicians and social scientists what the purpose of such fines is versus less life-changing punishments, since you pointed out that jailing for money is questionably legal, and he also suspects probably ineffective in changing behavior, I guess.
One of the things about both how the data is collected, but really how these fines are levied is that it's very local, right? And so it's at the discretion often at a local judge, and some judges believe that levying these fines is the way to induce, I think, cooperation or change, or in some cases, they might even make it the person being fined make an argument that they don't have the money, they're indigent and they're not believed, and so then they get fined anyway. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Hans, if you want to weigh in at all on this.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say other than, I think when the reporting that we've done on this comes out, we did try to talk to a variety of people, and I think different people have kind of different theories. I will say, I agree that from an economic perspective, just like a pure like dollars and cents cost benefit analysis, it's very expensive to keep people in jail, and you don't generate any revenue by doing it. So, I think part of it is that you do, however, generate revenue from collecting fines. And so there are places where local courts are expected to kind of generate a certain amount of their own revenue or even be revenue neutral. So I think that can be one contributor when it's, when that factor is present. But yeah, I don't know that I could speak.
But presumably it will cost more to put someone in jail than they could otherwise collect, right? If they had better incentives for people to pay up.
Yeah, but they don't pay. I mean, the people who are generating the revenue, the people who need to be revenue neutral don't foot the bill for putting people in jail. So that's, from their budgetary perspective, is free, whereas collecting the fine represents some revenue. So even though from a larger scale, it doesn't make economic sense within the confines of a single kind of government actor who's not looking at the whole picture, there can be incentives to do this.
Well, the incentive to put them in jail would be to sort of increase the likelihood that they will pay the fine, because they would charge the fine in any event.
I see. I understand what you're asking. I mean, I think it's to kind of make sure that people know they mean business. is probably the theory.
Got it. I'm curious. As you said, in many cases it's sort of hard to figure out if the jailing occurred because of a failure to pay a fine, or because of some other offense, and or maybe sometimes another offense is actually just a pretext, and it's in fact a sort of a failure to pay kind of case. What approach did you use to try to kind of separate, and filter out the real failure to pay cases?
Yeah, so I mean, the approach we took was a very conservative one. So we tried to focus on the cases where there was absolutely no ambiguity that the reason, or at least there was absolutely no documented ambiguity, that the reason that the person was jailed was for failure to pay. So that's why, all these numbers we're presenting are specifically people where when they were booked, there's no other reason given, there's no other kind of charge present other than failure to pay charges. I will say that, we tried to sort of redo the analysis looking at, so that's one extreme. The other extreme is you might say, let's count everyone who has kind of any failure to pay charges present. And when you do that, it certainly changes the numbers, but it doesn't change them by in order of magnitude. It changes them by, I'm going to say it, this isn't going to be quite right. I'm sorry, I should look at actually the appendix of our paper, but I think it changes them by like maybe something like 50%. So, somewhere in between those two extremes is maybe kind of the real number. But one issue is that it's very hard to, the case that I gave where it's like somebody's speeding and like, you're not going to go to jail for speeding, but then they have the failure to pay warrant. And so they are brought to jail and the speeding charge and the failure to pay warrant show up. That's like pretty clear cut, but I think for a lot of cases, it's just too hard for us kind of with the context that we have sitting where we are to figure out like counterfactually. So I think the best answer is, it's more or less the order of magnitude of the number we gave, but the number we gave is the conservative end of the spectrum.
Got it. Damien's saying, if people are being jailed for failure to pay offenses, what does it mean for debtors prison to be illegal in the United States?
So that's an easy answer, actually, that debtors prisons were banned under federal law in 1833. And then in 1983, the Supreme Court affirmed that incarcerating indigent debtors was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So it's unconstitutional to do this. But in fact, yes, we are finding that it's happening. Of course, the folks who are being jailed don't have a lot of recourse. They don't have a lot of political clout. They don't have a lot of representation. I don't know, Hans, if you want to.
If it's so clearly illegal, shouldn't the system work somehow that, there's some like, lawyers that work on a contingency fee basis, perhaps, and take the state court, for these, or is there immunity, or what? Why is that not happening?
Yeah, I want to be careful because I'm not a lawyer, and I know a lot of the people in the audience are. But so when I said that debtors prisons are illegal, I was specifically referring to, or illegal since the 19th century, I was specifically referring to like people going to jail for like private debts. So like Cheryl can't have me put in jail for failing to pay a loan that she makes me today. Although at one point in American history, she could have.
I see, okay.
But it is.
If you're owing money to the government, that's a different story.
Right, it's a different story. And as Charles said, there is this line of cases. I'm really getting into dangerous territory now, but there is this line of cases, which to me as a layperson seems to sort of pretty clearly establish that if you don't have the ability to pay, so if your failure to pay is not willful, is the term that they use, then you can't be put in jail for failing to pay. But the problem is, there's a lot riding on kind of what it means to willfully fail to pay. And I think one of the things that we've discovered talking to people is that different judges in different courts will have like very different interpretations of what it means for somebody to willfully fail to pay, and will take into account very different kinds of evidence. So, there are places where people will say, as an extreme, I suppose, you came in a car, you could sell the car to pay the fine. To me, that's kind of strikes me as unreasonable, to expect people to sort of, maybe they're like living out of their car or something like that. But, since everything kind of hinges on like this question of whether or not people are able to pay and what that means exactly, I think that's where kind of the gray area comes from.
It's subjective, basically.
Got it. All right, well, great. So folks, do you have any more questions for Hans and Cheryl? We're sort of already approaching the end of our time anyways, and I think if there are no more questions, I think we can close here. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting talk, and this is important work you're doing, and we appreciate you sharing it with our Codex community. And please keep us posted, and hopefully, Cheryl, you can get the article about this out very soon. I think it's an important topic that most people will not know about in this country. And so anyway, so it's almost like we got a early preview of your article, and so that's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And to all of you folks in the audience, thank you for joining us. This was our last speaker event for 2021. And I hope you have a great December, and we look forward to seeing you in 2022 for our next speaker series event. In January, you might also want to look out for our Future Law Conference. We're opening registration for our Future Law Conference in January. So yeah, stay tuned. And good to see you all again. Hans and Cheryl, thank you so much. It was great to have you. And bye-bye, everyone. All right, thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.